You came to the best one. You're so smart. Welcome again for those that heard me ramble earlier today. I'm Chris Colbert with the Harvard Innovation Labs. And you're literally in what I think is going to be the best session. And arguably, you could really argue, not that I'm competitive, by the way, we should have started this whole day with this session because, technology is amazing. Invention is amazing. Creation is amazing. But I'm a big believer or subscriber to the idea of the law of unintended consequences. That humans create things that they don't actually understand what the fundamental ramifications are, what the downstream impact on society is, and it hurts people, it hurts society. And so today we have an opportunity to have a discussion with two very bright people who are very steeped in this topic of sort of the ethical, moral, and legal ramifications of this new world called VR and AR. And I want to just introduce them, and then we'll get right into the conversation. To my immediate left is Christopher Bavitz, who is the Wilmer Hale Clinical Professor of Law at Harvard Law School, the Managing Director of the law school's Cyber Law Clinic, which is based in the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society, and he's also the faculty co-director of the Berkman Klein Center. And to his left is Christina. So you have a Chris, a Christopher, and a Christina, which is also by design. That's why we are the best event to attend. Christina Couch is a science journalist who specializes in technology and its impact on brains and behavior. Her work has been published in Nobinex, Fast Company, Coexist, MIT Technology Review, and Wired Magazine, and I'm sure a bunch of others. She's currently working on feature projects focused on using virtual reality and the science of loneliness. Very interesting. As well as a project on how technology is changing mental health in North Korea. Also very interesting. But let's start at the sort of highest level of this. So we heard all these stories today about the positive, potential, amazing benefits of this AR, VR, MR, NER technology. But what do they set up in terms of potential ethical, moral, legal dilemmas? So let's just. What do you think? What do you guys? And actually, let me comment. One last thing I want to say. Were you here for the Roney interview? Everybody here for the Roney interview? I don't know if you remember, but at some point in that interview, he said, "or bad things," when he was talking about the future of where this all could go. Bad things. And so that's the question. What are the bad things, and/or what are the ways to mitigate some of those bad things?
Right. Well, I mean, it's funny you talk about sort of maybe this should have been earliest in the day. I was telling someone over at the law school what I was doing today, and they said, "Oh, when's your panel? Maybe I'll stop by." I said, "Well, it's the last one of the day. It's a short 20-minute panel at the end of the day." And they said, "Typically, you put the legal and ethical stuff last. No one thinks about it." But the risk is that if you have the lawyer first, then it's going to tell you all the things that you can't do, and is going to stifle innovation. That's certainly the stereotype of how lawyers operate when they're counseling innovators. So it's something we try a lot in my program to teach students not to do, but it's sometimes hard to avoid it. I think when I think about VR and AR, I think about sort of the dry runs, if you will, the major technological leaps that we've seen in recent years that are sort of preparing us to deal with the good and the bad about virtual reality and augmented reality. Obviously, the internet writ large, I think, is a great testing ground, raises a lot of legal issues. We can talk specifically about intellectual property and privacy and all of the kinds of things that I think come up in this space as well. I think Internet of Things, which is very big right now, and just the idea of devices that we are engaging with probably in more passive ways, probably with less intentionality, with less opportunity to even go through the sham that we've read terms of use and privacy policies that can govern us, right? When we all click through terms on websites that ostensibly govern our relationship with the people that are collecting data about us, that and all of that. That's much harder to do with my Nest thermostat or my Fitbit. It's really hard to do if your glasses are recording me right now, right? I've had no engagement whatsoever with the company on the other side of your glasses. And so I think that I think it's sort of a logical extension, but it pushes some of the issues a little further. I think speaking again at a really high level, privacy is probably one of the biggest, if not the biggest issues on a bunch of different levels here. The first has to do with that collection point of data. And I'm thinking mostly now about sort of consumer and entertainment focused VR and AR apps that are, where it's not clear who in this room might actually be engaging with us, might actually be recording us, might actually be sending data about what's going on in this room back to someone. The not novel legal issues, right? I could do that with a microphone in my pocket. I could do that in a lot of different other different settings. But it's so unobtrusive, so passive, and so streamlined that I think it's going to force us to have to think a lot about things like the way we regulate recordings of speech, the way we regulate things like wiretapping, which is sort of the recording of you with or without your consent. And then I think there's a second layer to the privacy piece, which is beyond the point of collection. All of these applications, again, whether they're in the manufacturing space or medical space or consumer and entertainment, are collecting reams and reams of data and sending it back somewhere. And that data is extraordinarily valuable, just like the data about how we surf the internet is valuable, and the data that my Nest thermostat at home is valuable. But in some ways, it's now ubiquitous data. It's data potentially about every moment of our lives, and I think we're going to have to do some work to establish legal regimes and maybe norms around what we want these companies doing with that data. How I can imagine extraordinary benefits that could come out of those data sets, but also we need to make sure that we need to make sure we're all on the same page about what's going on with the data after it's collected.
Christine?
I think that there are a number of ethical issues that just surround the fact that virtual reality in particular has a number of psychological and behavioral impacts that traditional media outlets either have less of or just don't have at all. And so when we look at virtual reality, it can be used to treat post-traumatic stress disorder, phobias, anxiety, depression, any number of things. And that's specifically because it has an impact on our both conscious and unconscious minds. So when we look at building virtual reality media, one of the areas of interest that I have in terms of VR research is on its ability to break implicit bias. There are several studies out which show that if you have VR applications that are designed to break implicit bias, that there is some efficacy there, and that's really, really exciting. But that also means that VR has the potential to also reinforce terrible stereotypes and strengthen those implicit biases too. So I think it's an important ethical thing to look at. What types of media are we making? What are the impacts that has? That type of thing. Consent, I think, is another ethical issue. I don't think that consumers are aware of the fact that VR can have sort of psychological and behavioral impacts that other traditional media outlets do not. So, for example, there's at least one study looking at people tend to kind of take on the behaviors of the avatars that they embody in VR. And so there's at least one study out that shows that if you embody the avatar of an elderly person, people who do are more likely to actually save for retirement in their real lives. And so, right, so, I mean, that's a pretty astounding thing to me. So looking at kind of the psychological and behavioral changes, it's really important that people are aware of those before using virtual reality. And kind of the million-dollar question when it comes to VR is, what are the long-term effects, which we don't really have a ton of research on, especially looking at long-term effects of widespread VR use. So when we decide what's going into VR media, especially when it comes to things that we wouldn't do in our real lives, like particularly graphic scenes, it's important to know that we just don't have long-term research on that. And of course, this type of question comes up every single time a new piece of media comes out, a new media technology comes out. Certainly every time a new iteration of video game comes out, people always ask questions of, is Grand Theft Auto, for example, going to cause people to go on widespread crime sprees and that type of thing? So, I mean, the answer may very well be no, that having this type of immersive experience, really, you don't really see these type of acts being played out, but we got to check.
So whether the issues are ethical or legal, is there an organizing, I mean, given the nascent nature of this industry, is there an organizing body? How do you get ahead of it or even keep up with it? Or do you allow it to sort of unfold and do its terrible things and then we go, uh-oh, now we need to scurry around and fix a lot of stuff? Like, how do you...
Well, there is a code of ethics that was published in February of this year. So there is at least some sort of researched paper guidelines out there. So first of all, actually being educated on these types of things, I think, is one thing we could potentially do. I mean, in general, the media in general needs to be a lot better about how we portray various people. So, I mean, certainly considering what types of data are going into VR experiences and the media that's going in ahead of time is another way to mitigate it. We can diversify design teams. We can diversify people who are creating those types of media. I mean, those are a few things that we can do, even without any sort of, major technological leap in order to really make sure that at least some of these ethical questions are addressed.
I mean, I think on the legal side, similarly, we have the laws and the regulatory bodies that we have, and they change at a glacial pace. And we see that every time something new happens, whether it's Uber and ride sharing dealing with kind of longstanding state and local laws about who can offer transportation, or Tesla breaking the mold for new models of selling cars. Right, the law takes a long time to catch up to what's going on in technology. So I think it's unlikely that we're going to see sort of AR, VR specific legislation or regulation coming out anytime soon. And I'm not sure that's a bad thing. I mean, I think that in general, in a lot of cases, we want laws and regulations that are sort of technology agnostic. I'm not sure it's a great idea to go too far down the road of excessive regulation in the space. So it's going to be a function of trying to get out ahead of the new issues by simply taking the longstanding principles around privacy law, around intellectual property, around tort law, situations where one can cause harm to another in a virtual environment. Take the principles that we have in physical world environments and port them over. See how that goes. See how courts interpret things, and then kind of go from there.
Go ahead, Christine.
Sorry. We can also push to fund researching initiatives so that we have a very clear idea of what the impacts are. We can also push for designers to have some sort of mode where you can toggle in and out of virtual reality in case there is some sort of reaction that was unintended. I mean, there are definitely very concrete design decisions you can make in order to sort of mitigate some of these ethical
That have
concerns.
been made, or are being made, or should be made?
I mean, there is certainly, for a lot of the virtual reality products that are out there, there is at least some ability to step out of it. I think we could do a little bit better, but those conversations are being had on some level.
I mean, one of the potential sort of bridges between these two legal topics and ethical topics that I see is around that idea of consent. I think that in the U.S., at least, again, focusing on privacy as an issue, because I think that's a big one. In the U.S., we operate under what people call a notice and consent regime regarding privacy, unlike places like Europe, where privacy is extensively regulated, sort of top down. Here in the U.S., in general, outside some specific areas like health records and education records and kids, we have a regime that says, if you tell me what you're collecting about me and what you're doing with it, and I consent to it, that's generally okay. Now, there's all kinds of interesting questions about whether we all really have the information necessary to weigh the benefits versus the pros and cons of giving our data over to Google or Facebook, right? We get a free service out of that. We hand over our data to them, but there's a little bit of a fiction to say that any of us is qualified enough to really weigh, the potential privacy harms against the benefits that we're getting from those services. I think that becomes even harder when we're talking about a new technology, and particularly with VR and AR. And I think that some work could be done on educating people about consequences, both legal and psychological, mental, physical, and ethical, so that they're able to kind of make these decisions. Okay, I want to participate in this activity, and I fully understand the ramifications.
It seems like it's the very things that raise these ethical questions that make VR so great. I mean, it's immersive quality. It is the ability to step inside and forget the outside world that allows VR to be used in such wide therapeutic capacities. So, I mean, it's important to remember that VR has these very wide medical uses. We just need to really have an idea of how that would play out in a consumer market.
I've been trying to figure out, since we decided to go down this path at the iLab, sort of embracing the VR AR and really sort of trying to be an aggregator of everything that's going on in the space. I've been trying to figure out if there's a singular sort of psychology to it that has multiple applications. In other words, what is it about this immersive thing that is so powerful in a bunch of different ways, And I don't know, that's sort of off topic a little bit, but do either of you have a reaction to that? Like, what is it? Why is it so powerful? Why is it maybe both so beneficial and potentially even dangerous. Is it? Go ahead.
Well, I mean, VR does a really good job of taking another step to dissolve the boundary between virtual media and the real world. So, especially when you add in things like haptics, or for some PTSD treatments, they also incorporate smell and people holding guns that are a similar weight and size of guns that they would carry in combat. I mean, those types of things allow you to get lost in it, so your brain is perceiving virtual reality in a way closer to the real world than it would, say, consume traditional television. So I mean, it's that dissolving that I think gives VR these larger psychological behavioral impacts than, say, traditional television.
I mean, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think I agree completely. Although, I wonder if your question was suggesting that there is sort of a universality to that idea that applies to all VR and AR applications. And that's what I say. I actually don't know the answer to that, because I think I completely agree with Christina that the things that make it compelling and interesting and also fraught and complicated legally and ethically are those moments where it is really blurring the real and the virtual, and that's. There are other, does that apply if we're using an application that allows a customer service representative of a manufacturing machine, manufacturer of a machine, do service on that machine from a distance? I don't know. I mean, it probably doesn't apply the same way it does with some of the kinds of applications that Christina's been talking about, which seem, again, both extraordinary and terrifying, both from a patient consent perspective and all of that. So I don't know if there's a universality. I do think that some things that get lumped under VR and AR are essentially extensions of technologies that we already have in our pockets on our phone. It's a better rendering, it's a higher quality experience, but it's not necessarily blurring the boundary the way I agree that Christina is suggesting is sort of the meat of this.
Did you want to add something, or no? Okay. So actually, because we have a couple minutes left, since this is the last session, I wanted to actually open it up for questions.
I think a decent amount about how much can be done locally versus in the cloud. I think especially with regards to so much data being collected, if you could weigh in on that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it strikes me that, again, this is something we've already dipped our toe into with things like smartphones and smaller devices, where the future is in the cloud, right? My guess is that the VR, AR headsets and things like that are themselves not going to be the repository, at least a long-term repository for much of this data. And so it's going to reside on someone else's servers, a third-party servers. That joke or T-shirt or bumper sticker, there is no cloud, it's just someone else's computer. So I'm not sure what legal significance that ultimately has, other than, again, it drives home this point that, as is the case with so many internet applications and IoT applications and other things, we are handing over extraordinary quantities of data to somebody else, and that raises cybersecurity implications, privacy implications, and all of that.
The question, in the back.
This is a question for Chris. Isn't that easy?
That's confusing.
As I see that in the VR and AR world of research, there's some of the folks looking at entertainment, and you mentioned some of the applications for PTSD, medical, evoked response. It's a great platform for that. Do you see any liability issues coming up for the entertainment groups that are going to have these evoked responses? They're not aware that they're using it because these two groups aren't talking to each other.
I certainly, absolutely. I mean, I've been focused a lot on privacy, but I think general sort of tort law, whether it could sound in the world of medical malpractice, or it could sound in the world of sort of more standard physical torts where I'm wearing something over my eyes and trip over something. I think that is a place where we're going to have to see a lot of action legally, and it's only a matter of time until an injury takes place, and I'm sure it's already happening, where an injury takes place in a virtual space, or when something that happens in the virtual space, as you say, provokes a response, causes someone physical or emotional harm, and they're going to seek to be compensated for that. There will inevitably be efforts to try and minimize that liability using waivers and contractual EULAs and agreements with the users of these products. But I think the jury's still out on how those standards are going to be set.
We can, just to jump in, we can also push to have designers do more testing protocols to really have a firm understanding of how their products are making an impact. I know recently a VR product came out that was a tightrope walk experience between two buildings, and people who did it, first of all, a large number of people couldn't do it at all, and the people who did evoked responses as if they were actually doing it themselves. So sweating, people sort of lost their minds a little bit doing it. And so, I mean, that's the kind of thing that you really need to build into your quality assurance testing and have an idea of what the physiological responses are going to be. So we can push for that from a design perspective as well.
Okay, so as a risk taker, child psychologist, clinical psychologist, high-risk obstetrician, now going into this realm. I
should call a lawyer.
I'm glad you said risk. Okay, so I have still hanging over my head the lives and brains of kids up to the age of 18. So if someone were, if a physician, psychologist were to develop or to help it develop a game, some type of application using AR or VR, and I've seen some kids go really, really wild on AR, chasing Pokemon. And I assume that the developing brain, or the for VR usage is going to be vulnerable. Is that the last area in which one should go, or is that going to happen automatically because the parents will hand the kid something to keep them occupied, and the parents will be the ones who will be the ones being liable for it? I mean, who's going to be holding the bag? Is it going to be the doc who's the advisor? Is it going to be the developer? Is it going to be the owner of the device, the owner of the developer of the software, or none of the above?
Well, none of the above or all of the above. I mean, the way this will play out in the earliest phases is that someone who is allegedly suffers an injury in somewhere, in one of these environments like you're talking about, will assert that claim against everybody, from the manufacturer of the product, the distributor of the product, the physician who supplied the product. And again, we have existing legal regimes like product liability regimes around medical devices, for example, that apportion liability to various parties in that chain. A lot of that apportionment, I think, relies upon some of that apportionment at least relies upon people making knowledgeable, informed decisions about their care, and it's hard to do that when we're in such a nascent field, right? It's one thing to do that when you're getting a heart stent or something like that, where we've done this a bazillion times before. It's much harder to do it when we're breaking new ground. So again, I think it's going to be, I don't know if I have a great answer other than to say it will be a matter of time before we see how that liability change shakes out. Again, I think it will depend on what kind of liability is being disclaimed, what state you're in. I mean, we haven't talked about the fact that a lot of the kinds of issues we're talking about, tort liability, privacy liability, have very different rules in different states and certainly in different countries. I mean, we talked about sort of US versus EU rules around privacy. That's going to be true for all sorts of products.
Other questions?
So I guess this question is probably aimed at Christina. Can you speak to kind of if any ethical concerns have come up around the fact of Silicon Valley and a lot of these high-tech companies being majority white, majority male, creating realities that alongside their epistemic privilege are going to have these worlds that exist within their world but not actual reality?
Oh, I'm so excited you asked. I mean, I have ethical concerns about it. I'm not sure, as far as having that issue being raised specifically in a virtual reality context, I mean, I personally haven't seen a ton of media surrounding that, but I mean, as evidence builds in terms of virtual reality's ability to break implicit bias, it certainly should be an ethical concern when we look at whether the teams designing these products are diverse, who they're pandering to, what types of media are involved, if there are blind spots in terms of that kind of thing. And when we look at the media that is outside of VR, the media is not doing a super good job of that to begin with. And so when you take an industry that has historically not done a tremendously good job of being fair to everybody, and you move it to another industry that is historically majority white, it looks like a recipe for there to be at least a few issues. And so starting to have those conversations early when VR is really not quite as widespread as it's going to be in the next couple of years is tremendously important. And I wish that more people were talking about it.
Any remaining questions? I have one. That's a quantitative question. On a 1 to 10 scale, where 10 is fully mature and 1 is we are just at the tiny, like just at the beginning. What's your sense of this? Is it is it like really, really early?
I don't think it's a 1. I mean, again, looking at it from my perspective, again, I think mapping on existing regimes to these technologies, these aren't.
That's not a 1.
These aren't brand new issues that have come out of nowhere. The way we typically evaluate law student success in our law school classes is the issue spotter question. It's a very complex hypo, and then you apply the law to it. This is an issue spotter. I could throw a VR and AR at a student, and we could come up with the top 10 legal issues they're going to face. They're not coming out of thin air, so it's somewhere in the middle there, I think.
Do you agree?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, we have more than 20 years worth of research on using VR to treat PTSD. This is not a thing that's coming out of nowhere, but I do think that we're at a 1 in terms of looking at the widespread impact of it because we're just not there yet. So maybe like a 4 and then a 1 if we're looking at just the pure widespread long-term everyday use of it.
Yeah. Okay, great. All right, well, thank you both very much. I appreciate your comments and your insight.